We're probably ready to get going here. So once again, welcome everyone to our webinar today. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Ping Lin, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sophie. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for attending the Innovations of Language Assessment webinar. And hope everyone is having a good day. We, like many of you, are very excited to have Dr. Xun Yan join us today. For those who don't know who Dr. Xun Yan is, he is a professor of linguistics, second language acquisition and teacher education, and educational psychology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He is a faculty member in the Beckman Institute for Advanced Science and Technology. Xun's research interests include speaking and writing assessment, psycholinguistic and computational approaches to language testing. He and also language assessment literacy. So his recent work has been published in journals including Applied Linguistics, Language Learning, Language Testing, and Language Assessment Quarterly, just to name a few. In today's webinar, Xun will present one of his recent research studies titled, "What Does It Mean to Be Fluent in a Language? The Benefits and Complexities of Contextualizing Fluency and Disfluency in Assessing Oral Language Proficiency." So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Xun Yan.
Thank you very much, Piling, and thank you, Sophie, for the kind invitation and introduction. It's a great honor to be here to share a little bit of what I do at Illinois and also discuss with you my reflections and biases in thinking about this topic. But let me first share my slides. All right. Hopefully you're able to see the screen. So fluency is a very big topic. I think even the thought about talking about fluency in assessment context is a daunting task. So in today's presentation, I'm sure I'll be missing a lot of references. I tried my best to add as many as I can, but also trying to contain it within 40 minutes. But at the same time, I know I'll be missing out on a lot of good studies that I need to reference. But today I want to focus on hopefully a different perspective in thinking about fluency because we know it's an important construct in language assessment for decades. There seems to be good consensus about what fluency means, but there are also a lot of challenges and complexities when we operationalize fluency and disfluency when we're trying to assess someone's oral language proficiency. So today I hope to start to focus on these challenges and complexities when we move away probably from the mainstream approach to fluency in assessment. All right, so we know that speech fluency has been widely studied in applied linguistics, or even beyond. There are many interesting studies that approach fluency from different perspectives. But despite the disciplinary differences, I think in one way or another, there's a central question that underlines research studies in all these fields. That is, what does it mean to be fluent in a language, right? We might have all kinds of assumptions and beliefs about what fluency means, right? Because we're language testers, we always think about this particular construct. But how can we actually operationalize in speaking assessment hasn't been fully discussed, in my personal opinion. And we can see that from the conceptualizations of L2 fluency, and many different definitions of this particular construct show the variability in terms of how we can approach this construct. Starting from, for example, Lenin, he's think about fluency in sort of the broad and narrow senses. And in the broad sense, he considered fluency as sort of a synonym to overall language proficiency. But if you look at definition of that construct within that same time period, and you will see that there are all kinds of terms being used to describe fluency, including automaticity, linguistic complexity, coherence, and even creativity. So it's quite broad and all-encompassing. But in the narrow sense, he argues that a lot of the studies on fluency are focusing on this temporal characteristic of speech, where we're looking at either the rapidity of speech or the smoothness of speech, which is about the lack of disfluency. And focusing on this sort of narrow domain of fluency, we got more scholars who are trying to conceptualize this concept The probably most widely known model of fluency is Galowitz's triadic model, where he really puts a cognitive perspective to the construct of fluency and differentiate between three kinds of fluencies: cognitive fluency, utterance fluency, and perceived fluency. What's really important with this model is that it tries to put a causal link or perspective to fluency, where the cognitive fluency really indicates what happens inside the speaker. It's about the efficiency of processing linguistic information so that it can be executed through speech production. And when the speaker possesses certain level of automaticity, and that gets reflected in measurable, you can call it objective utterance fluency features. And when these features are presented to the listener through their ears, they can develop some kind of evaluation or impression about that speaker's fluency, and that's the perceived fluency, right? So you can see this causal link in that when fluency occurs or disfluency occurs, all of these gets transmitted into the listener's ears, and it's a two-way street in a sense that it's not just about what the speaker is able to produce, but it's also about what listener is able to hear and capture. So you can argue that, at least from a cognitive perspective, fluency definitely reflects the extent to which sort of learners can process information with automaticity. But so you could argue that for highly proficient speakers or L1 speakers, you're expecting certain level of automaticity because they possess that language proficiency, or you expect to see certain level of fluency from their speech. But it's important to also caution that there might be sort of this logical fallacy of affirming the consequent, meaning that we could consider fluency as a byproduct of language proficiency, but the other way around might not actually work, meaning that fluency is not all about language proficiency, right? So when you think about language proficiency, there's much more than just producing fluent rhymes. And in fact, and you dig a little bit deeper, and you will see that fluency is not just about rapidity. And also, developing fluency shouldn't be the main purpose of language use and acquisition. What I mean by that is, if we consider fluency as a byproduct of language proficiency, we know that it's probably hard to teach fluency directly. And we would hope that fluency will come as your proficiency increases. So the focus of fluency is interesting because on one hand, we know it's an important construct, but at the same time, if we translate that into teaching and learning, it's very hard to teach this construct. And also, proficiency is not about the absence of disfluencies because disfluency is not random. And many times they are happening because the listener would like to signal certain kind of discourse planning strategies. And even beyond the cognitive perspectives, we know that disfluency sometimes can carry sociocultural meanings, and also they can achieve certain kind of functions in discourse management and an interaction. So when we look at disfluency in L1 speech, we know that even though, we can find different kinds of explanations for their occurrences, that disfluencies are also ubiquitous. Different kinds of corpus studies might give you slightly different statistics, but in general, there's a trend about how frequent they occur in natural speech. And disfluencies also vary in their frequencies and their duration, and also the type and functions. I guess to date, the most widely used framework of classifying disfluencies is seeing disfluencies as having sort of this four big elements, right? Filled pauses, silent pauses, repetition, and reformulations, which basically means the difference between repetition and reformulation is that with repetition, you're not adding additional words that is going beyond, or information beyond the proposition in your original utterance, whereas reformulations shows a conscious effort of editing and changing the utterance that you want to produce. Studies have also shown a lot of nuances in disfluencies. In particular, there's a great literature just investigating the phenomena of pauses. And studies suggest that there is a difference when you look at pause type, meaning that when you, for example, when you're comparing filled pauses versus silent pauses, there are different functions in how they fulfill in discourse management and interaction. Um, and then these nuances tend to be captured by either L1 speakers or highly advanced L2 speakers, both from a speaker's perspective and a listening perspective. But the nuances of how these pause types might work in speech are not as clearly prominent when you look at speech produced by, relatively speaking, low level of proficiency among L2 speakers. In addition to pause type, there's also studies that look into pause position, which is about where pauses are located. And in general, there's a consensus that in L1 speech, at least, pause tend to happen more frequently at a juncture. It could be morphosyntactic juncture, it could be semantic juncture, or even phonological juncture, indicating that when speakers are making disfluencies or having challenges when they produce speech, they don't just pause at a random place. They try to project ahead and then try to pause at a juncture place so that they can signal to the listener that there's something coming, or the speaker is actually having difficulties or having considerations in terms of what to say next. But this kind of pausing behavior is also not very clear in L2 speakers, at least based on what the research findings suggesting. And in fact, whether or not L2 speakers can pause in the expected places can be a very strong marker of their proficiency. And in addition to locations and type, there's also a lot of literature looking into to what extent pauses can be repaired. So, and the study seems to suggest that advanced L2 speakers are more successful at repairing pauses. And they also tend to use more anticipatory repair strategies like hesitation and repetition to actively signal the repair than just direct reformulations. But in addition to these trends, I think it's also important to highlight that disfluencies are not just about cognitive processes. And lots of studies in corpus linguistics and also studies in sociolinguistics are suggesting that in addition to these cognitive factors, sociocultural factors and also situational characters of interaction might also play a role in shaping disfluencies in speech. So we know that it's a fairly complex picture when it comes to disfluency, definitely a lot more complex than what is shown on the surface. To better understand the nature of disfluency, I think it's important to look at how they occur and the linguistic context within which that disfluency occurs. According to Lavelle, speech disfluency typically happens in three stages. At the beginning stage, there's this monitoring and detection of the need to change or edit your speech. And this stage typically is marked by, incomplete words or words that are uttered but are clearly mismatching with a previous utterance. And later on, scholars like Schreiber consider this as sort of the referendum, meaning that this is the part that you need to edit in your speech. And this monitor or detection stage is immediately followed by an editing phase, where in this phase, that's where all the disfluencies occur. You typically see a lot of filled pauses, like what I just did. And this kind of disfluencies can vary in size and complexity. And once this signal is being conveyed, the speaker will then follow a repair stage where they actually execute the repair and try to go back on track of their original speech. Right. So the what this model is really suggesting that is the occurrence of disfluencies tend to be marked by multiple features. Their occurrence is never just a single incidence of a single disfluency element. When things happen, you should be able to actually get more insights from the linguistic context about what the speaker is actually experiencing, and hopefully why that speaker is actually making that repair. So and behind this, there's also a clear assumptions about disfluencies. If we want to look at disfluency in this kind of structure of comprising referendum, the editing phase, and the repair. The first test explicit assumption is that when disfluency happens, listeners and speaker will notice, and you need to signal the disfluencies to begin with. So this assumptions provides the basis for us to try to find markers of disfluency. And the second assumption is that this speakers will constantly monitor and repair their speech, and this is by human nature. If humans don't really monitor their speech, we wouldn't see disfluencies because maybe they might not even be conscious of the need to repair speech, right? So if we're operating under these assumptions, then it makes sense for us to look deeper into the structure of disfluency. On this slide, I'm showing some examples of how disfluencies might vary. And you can see if we consider the target utterance a speaker is trying to produce is parking is free on Sunday, and there might be different ways of that, how that sentence might lead to different errors. And then if you particularly pay attention to the editing phase, you will see there are different combinations of disfluencies. You could be, for example, in example two, the disfluency or the editing phase could be just a simple silent pause. But if you compare that to example 9 and 10, you will see that in the editing phase, there are different combinations of disfluencies, right? Like parking is free is up free on Sunday, right? So we know that maybe from this example, we might be able to suspect that the speakers are having a bigger trouble putting the sentence together. And therefore, this complexity of the editing phase might say something about proficiency. And you might also have speakers like in the example 10 that even after a labored or laborious attempt to repair that disfluency, they might still fail and then decide to abandon the utterance and start anew. So that leads us to the question about the relationship between disfluency and proficiency, right? So if we look at the examples above four, it seems to make sense that a lot of the disfluency will tell us something about proficiency. And these fluencies are quite salient. If you think about when you're hearing someone's speech and trying to perceive what they're actually producing, we tend to notice disfluencies or a certain type of disfluencies a lot more than just the rapidity of speech. And in L2 proficiency, or when we think about L2 assessment too, the link between disfluency and proficiency can be further supported through a lot of these cognitive models of disfluency. And if we situate this in the assessment context, we first of all can argue that disfluency provide a window to the cognitive processes of speech production. Because of this link, we are able to translate disfluency phenomenon to the level of proficiency that the speaker possesses. Even though we know that fluencies are a natural phenomenon in speech, but the prevalence or the excessive amount of disfluencies might actually show a marker of lacking L2 proficiency. And if you look at Segalowitz models, there's all kinds of hypotheses to indicate there might be fluency vulnerability points where L2 speakers might develop disfluency because of the challenges when processing speech. And when this translates into speaking assessment tasks and assessment rating scales, we can see there's great diversity in terms of how people operationalize disfluency. Some skill descriptors might maintain at a very abstract level and thinking about disfluencies in relation to just automaticity. But you will also have rating scales where the descriptors go into sort of a greater depth and detail about how this fluency can be expected and how that suggests or infer what the test takers are actually doing or thinking while producing speech, and therefore how we can say about their proficiency. But in general, there's also this diversity in the rating scale also aligns with how fluency or utterance fluency is operationalized in practice. And in general, we can see four dimensions of operationalization. One is the speed, the breakdown, which is more about the pauses, and the repair, and productivity, especially in earlier literature. This is more about how much you can produce. And when we think about all these features, one question that we naturally ask would be, are they equally predicting of language proficiency? And through our meta-analysis, it seems to suggest that these fluency features or disfluency features are not equal. In general, we found that speed features tend to predict proficiency very strongly. And in contrast, the breakdown and repair features are not as predictive. And this is coming from an analysis of 71 studies with a fairly large effect sizes pool. But this might be a little bit disappointing, right? If you think about that, all we've talked about so far is about disfluencies, is about saliency of disfluency when we hear someone speak. When seeing the lack of a strong correlation between disfluencies and proficiency, it seems to have some kind of a mismatch here. But if we look deeper into the specific fluency variables that different studies adopt, we can see some interesting nuances that align with previous literature or our expectation. First is that in general, filled pauses tend to be less predictive than silent pauses, because silent pauses tend to indicate, at least in the previous literature, stronger effort in processing linguistic information. And also, if you look at pause location or junctures, we tend to see that in general, juncture pauses are less predictive than non-juncture pauses, meaning that the more disfluence that we find in unexpected places, the more um, the more we can say about the lack of proficiency in the speaker. So in general, I think what we find is that there is this mismatch that probably doesn't really align with our perception, with speed still being the most predicting. And some scholars might argue that certain speed features, especially like speech rate, should be considered as a composite feature because they tap into not just speed, but also pausing as well. So you could say that, it's tapping into two dimensions. But the fact that in general, this dimension has a stronger prediction than disfluencies in general seems to suggest there might be something missing there, at least something that we don't know, right? When we have this perceptual mismatch. At the very least, we seems to have some indirect evidence that suggests that maybe the fine-grained look or the closer look of disfluency features might tell us a little bit more because we did show that finer differences between fine-grained features of disfluency. So perhaps one way of taking a closer look at disfluency is trying to contextualize it by comparing that with other kinds of fluency features and examining when and where that happens. So this contextualization can actually provide a richer interpretation of speakers' oral language proficiency. And in particular, given that fine-grained analysis of disfluency will look deeper into the occurrences, maybe it can reflect the cognitive processes of speech production more. And this can easily translate into a lot of the models that we have in language assessment. For example, when we look at performance evaluation, performance-based assessment, we can easily align cognitive fluency, utterance fluency, and perceived fluency to the different interacting components in a speaking task. And when we're looking into validity frameworks too, we can also find places where the investigation of disfluencies can provide useful insights. For example, in the sociocognitive validity framework, we can definitely find a place where disfluency can speak to cognitive validity. And in the interpretive argument-based validity framework, we can also argue that the understanding of disfluencies can provide insights about explanation or evaluation inferences. So we could argue that if we look at disfluency features in closer lenses, perhaps we can find interesting nuances, not just in terms of how they predict proficiency, but also might be in terms of how they are associated with other linguistic features. Maybe altogether they can reflect language automaticity. So in our work, when looking at British Council's aptitude test, we did find some indirect evidence of this. That is, when we tried to put all the fluency features alongside with complexity and accuracy features, we start to see that the fine-grained disfluency features tend to pattern differently than macro fluencies. So if you look at macro fluency features like speech rate, articulation rate, or just the count of pauses, they tend to form their own cluster. Whereas if you look at juncture pauses and even repair success, these features tend to correlate or be associated more with complexity features and accuracy features. So maybe that suggests that the fine-grained disfluencies are closely related to lexical grammar than the macro fluency features. And we find further evidence when we look at IELTS as well. When we perform a multidimensional analysis of all the linguistic features, we tend to see two dimensions that show the differences between macro levels fluency and the micro or the fine-grained disfluency features. That's very interesting, even though the two dimensions are both correlating with language proficiency scores, but the fact that they're separated suggests that these features might speaking to slightly different constructs. And while we're doing this analysis, we had a lot of fun looking into the transcripts of speech. And here is an example showing the dimension of micro-level disfluency and colloquial fluency. And colloquial fluencies are really just the kind of linguistic forms that mark the colloquial or the sort of the spoken discourse, and especially in fluent runs, right? So on the left-hand side, we see a level 5 on IELTS from Punjabi L1 speaker, and the right-hand side we see a band 8 score from Punjabi speakers. But what I want to highlight here is that if you look at the left, this is the disfluent speech transcript. When we look at the things that are highlighted in blue, we can see lots of repetitions and reformulations. But when they occur, they also tend to happen alongside with things like filled pauses, right? So, at least based on this, we can see that when disfluency happens, it doesn't happen in isolation, right? Even though they also from the multidimensional analysis, we know that these features are correlating with other linguistic features. But looking at the transcript give us a clear example that when we actually see individual occurrence of disfluencies, there's also this collection of different kinds of disfluency elements, right? This suggests that disfluency doesn't happen in isolation. When something happens, when the speaker detects a need to repair, there needs to be multiple markers of maybe a disfluency chain that tell us something about the cognitive effort of the speaker. So, in fact, disfluency chains, or the closer look of disfluency co-occurrences, has been studied for decades as well. In early research, scholars have documented this phenomena of co-occurrence. And in fact, a lot of the interpretation of these co-occurrence is centering around to what extent this can be viewed as a signal of the speaker to the listener about the discourse planning. But at the same time, there's also interesting findings that try to differentiate disfluency chains or disfluency co-occurrence in sort of the local versus the global level. And at the local level, that speaks to what we just said, that when something happens, it doesn't happen in isolation. There's a chain of disfluency elements. But in addition, at the global level, there's also this observation that if in a bigger utterance unit, if a disfluency chain occurs at the beginning of the utterance, chances are it might influence the fluency of the later part of the utterance, right? The speaker might actually experience more difficulties and challenges simply because the previous repair has taken up a lot of working memory or cognitive resources from the speaker. So the likelihood, the probability of seeing a disfluency chain at the starting point of an utterance might actually predict the likelihood of seeing another disfluency chain later on in the same utterance, right? So then if we go back to our example, we can see that when we look at disfluencies and we further decompose or decode the editing phase, we can see different kinds of combinations of disfluency elements, right? It could be a single element of just a filled pause or silent pause, but it could be a combination of many different things, silent pause, filled pause, plus repetition or even reformulation, right? Maybe the structural complexity and even the length of these disfluencies can be quantified and used as variables to predict proficiency. So in our exploration, we tried to took on this assumption or this hypothesis and trying to see if we can operationalize it. And in our paper, we proposed this idea of looking at disfluency co-occurrence in multiple layers. So at the bottom layer, we could argue that each disfluency can be registered within an utterance. You will see individual occurrence of those elements, like a filled pause, a silent pause, but they're all consisted within a disfluency chain, and each chain might have different composition. But when you look at all the different type of chains, you might even further be able to classify these different fluency chains into different types of disfluencies or different patterns of disfluencies. And then depending on, maybe the learner's proficiency or other kinds of considerations or sociocultural factors, maybe each speaker might actually utilize different proportions of disfluency patterns, and that might contribute to some kind of a disfluency profile. And based on these layers of disfluency co-occurrence, we might ultimately link individual occurrence of disfluency elements to the speaker characteristics like their proficiency. And based on this, we dig a little bit deeper into the IELTS data. And what we first look at is just looking at the combination of different disfluency elements within each AS unit and trying to see if we can classify these different kinds of AS units. And through cluster analysis, we did find four kinds of AS unit clusters. These are, AS units that are, some of them are, if you look at cluster one and cluster three, these are utterances that are of medium length. They're not too short, not too long, but each of them have a little bit of disfluency. It could either be silent pause plus repair, or it could be filled pause plus repair. And on top of that, we also see cluster 2 and cluster 4, where cluster 2 is more about the long runs with lots of pauses and repairs. And then cluster 4 is actually about the short runs without a lot of disfluencies. So this is a part where things get really interesting because if we correlate these clusters with language proficiency scores, what we see is that the cluster 2 and cluster 3 have meaningful correlation with proficiency, and the cluster 1 and 2 do not. So what that suggests to us is that having disfluencies is not necessarily a bad thing, especially when you're predicting medium runs. It makes sense for people to pause, right? But what makes the difference is the cluster 2 and cluster 4. So having long runs with lots of pauses and repair is actually a negative indicator of proficiency. And and this makes sense because, when you have to show laborious repair in speech, maybe it shows a lack of proficiency. But what's more interesting is that the short runs with without a lot of disfluencies have a stronger positive correlation with proficiency. That suggests that perhaps being proficient is not about just running fluent runs in long sentences, but is probably more characterized by, producing shorter runs to maintain the flow of speech. And this lack of information dense, long, and complex runs might actually be a good characteristic of speech communication. But while all of these make sense, what we found very interestingly is that if you break it down by different language backgrounds, the prediction didn't really hold up for every single L1. In particular, we see stronger predictions or the alignment of patterns for L1 Chinese speakers and L1 Punjabi speakers, but this association didn't really seem to be meaningful for Arabic speakers. So that creates implications for whether or not we can actually use this kind of disfluency co-occurrence to predict proficiency across all contexts. Then we not just we see differences across L1s, we've also looked at to what extent these disfluency co-occurrence can hold up across different speech tasks. So here we adopt the same kind of framework and looked into a local test which we had from Purdue University. We look at both the controlled speech task, which is an eliciting imitation task, and the open-ended speech task, which is a summary of listening of a conversation. What we found was, if we just look at the disfluency patterns, there are interestingly different patterns that we observe. There's some similarities, but there are also differences. The first similarity that if we compare is, if we look at the controlled speech tasks, we see four patterns of disfluency. One is just in general the lack of disfluency. There's also pair with explicit hesitation, and both of these have positive correlation with proficiency scores. We also have word-only repairs. These tend to feature sort of like repairs from the original utterance, which might be a characteristic of the sentence repetition task itself. So when we see this, it tends to be going back to the sentence that was produced and trying to realign what is being produced by the speaker and what the speaker heard in the task. And the last category is a very quick recall-like behavior. But when we move on to open-ended speech tasks, we also see laborious repair. In some way, we can kind of see it as the same as lack of disfluency. It's just going in the opposite direction. We also see repair with explicit hesitation, which also gives a positive correlation. But in contrast to the recall-like behavior, now we start to see repair with silence. And interestingly, recall-like behavior is the kind of runs where the speaker quickly identifies something that they've misproduced in the sentence, and then they're going back to repair the speech to better align and to better remember what is actually being produced in the original sentence that they need to repeat. Whereas in the open-ended speech, we don't have this kind of recall-like behavior. And instead, we start to see a lot more repair with silence, where probably that is showing an indication where the test takers or the speakers are trying to actually get their sentences together. Because it's free form, it's open-ended, there needs to be a conscious effort put together so that the speaker can actually produce fluent runs or produce sentences to convey their meaning, right? So while they're doing so, there might be more challenges and difficulty that the speaker is actually experiencing. So again, when we're looking at these disfluency co-occurrences, all of these patterns seems to make sense. They seems to be able to explain disfluency behavior. But if we actually subject these to predicting proficiency scores, we notice differences across L1 backgrounds and across tasks. So now we're faced with kind of a dilemma, right? Even though it's a quick glimpse through of all the studies, but I think the message, hopefully the message is fairly clear, is that when we're dealing with these fine-grained disfluencies, and especially when we're trying to contextualize disfluencies, we get pros and cons. The benefit of it is that now it seems like these contextualized interpretations bring us closer to our original assumption about what it means to be fluent. There's a perceptual match that we're heading towards. And then this disfluency co-occurrence can explain proficiency differences, especially when you're trying to understand what the speaker might be doing when you look at these disfluency patterns. But the challenge or the complexities is that there are differences across L1 and speaker tasks, and probably in other kinds of in relation to other kind of factors that we haven't explored in these studies. And these differences create fairness issues and considerations. For example, if, let's say, we have rating scales that have such a fine-grained descriptions about what this fluency might manifest in different score levels, will that relationship hold up across different L1s? Or are we actually embedding more biases potentially in expecting sort of a unified relationship between disfluency and proficiency, right? Or given the differences between different kind of tasks, can we expect the same relationship between disfluencies and proficiencies, right? These are things that we need to consider. And we don't really see as much discussion about that, at least maybe in my biased opinion, in language testing literature, although there's a lot in neighboring fields when they understand disfluencies and fluency. And in addition to that, I think one thing that remains to be explored is to what extent disfluencies are related to interactional competencies or the construct that start to evolve beyond the traditional traditional proficiency construct. And in particular, if we venture into domains like pragmatic knowledge, there's great literature that suggests that sometimes we might not always expect fluent runs when we produce speech or having a conversation. There might be all kinds of pragmatic considerations where disfluencies are preferred, right? In that case, what if you're in a situation, especially given we start to see more and more conversational tasks now with technology, what if you're in a conversation where parts of the speech or parts of the conversation tend to favor fluency and parts of the conversation tend to disfavor fluency? How can we put it together in a rating scale? Or how do we translate that into automated scoring systems, right? These are the things that we need to consider as we embrace these more authentic tasks or more interactive tasks. And in addition to that, I think it's always important to note that disfluencies is a negotiated process. And as we know, when people are having conversations, there's a natural tendency for speakers to gradually converge with each other, to show alignment, to build rapport, right? When this happens, how can we view this fluency as a single side of reflection of a speaker's proficiency or interactional competence, right? How do we deal with this interaction and negotiation in the larger interactive contexts? And just this fluency alone might give us a lot of interesting sites for investigation. I'm sure the findings will be mixed, but I think it's a good mix because it challenges us to think about our assumptions about how we should design our task and how we should evaluate speaking performances. So in conclusion, I think, hopefully I've demonstrated enough that fluency is not just about the absence of disfluency, and when they occur, they don't occur in isolation. So this contextualization of disfluency or fluency can provide additional interpretation of language use and language proficiency in ways those individual fluency features might not. But at the same time, what it means to be fluent might differ across tasks, L1s, and even beyond, right? The nature and reason behind these disfluencies and their relationship with proficiency needs to be investigated further. And there's also more research that's needed in general for us to really think about the role of disfluencies in L2 speaking assessment. And this is why I argue very strongly we're far from being reaching a consensus about what fluency and disfluency mean for assessment context, especially that tend to be probably either not if they're not the most important, but at least a very important dimension of language proficiency underlying a lot of the proficiency assessments that we have. And I think more research is needed not only to investigate the occurrence of disfluency, but also to investigate the forms and functions of disfluencies in relation to how these might be impacted by different cognitive and sociocultural factors. I think until then, we should continue to hold fluency and our operationalizations of fluency with a grain of salt and always reflect on any kind of biases we might carry as we operationalize or create our tasks and create our rating scales and train human raters and machine raters to score speaking performances. So given that these are some of the references, and I'd like to thank a lot of people. So these are the people who are, well, the co-authors are of the research that I'm showing today are listed on the left-hand side. A lot of them from our Illinois group, and we also have collaborators from University of Arizona, University of California, LA, and UC Irvine. And in addition to that, I also like to thank Li Xia Chen from Purdue University, who's helped us a lot in terms of getting the data for us and allowing us to use the local test. And April Ginther, who's my advisor, who inspired me to think about the construct of fluency since my dissertation project. So I think this process has been over 10 years, but I think I'm grateful to her for bringing me on to this journey to think about this construct in language assessment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Xun, so much. We have some questions here. If anyone would like to post any questions, please use the Q&A function. So this first question right here is fluency important when you are able to put your thoughts across, even if you are disfluent?
Sorry, Billy, can you repeat the question again?
Is fluency important when you are able to put your thoughts across, even if you are disfluent?
Oh, that's actually a very interesting question. I think it depends on context. And it also depends on whether you're in an assessment context or you're in more of a teaching and learning context, right? My immediate reaction would be, there are definitely contexts where fluency should give way to, efforts to put sentences together and also efforts to convey meaning in an interaction, right? So I think there are contexts where disfluency might not matter. But I think I also understand if you put in an assessment context in certain places, especially in traditional proficiency assessment, we still value the illustration of fluency because in some ways it still demonstrates the efficiency of the communication, right? So I think I don't like to see fluency and disfluency as sort of the opposite of each other, but they're really offering different perspectives and give us information about what we can say about the speaker and maybe the listener, but also how we can further support their development of language ability and fluency if it's embedded in a teaching context.
Great, thank you. So here's another question. If Not really sure, I feel like this particular question is like based on what you said in the presentation, but this is what they said. If
Oh,
an automated grading system of AI first English language proficiency test rate a disfluent speech harshly, what could be the solution?
mm, these are all big questions. I think the first step I would say is trying to diagnose where the biases might occur. I think it's hard to be overlooked because we know from either meta-analyses or previous studies that the relationship between fluency variables and proficiency is so strong that we tend to take it for granted, right? But I think there are missing spots that we need to be more cautious. So if we are, if we're suspecting that an automated scoring system is actually treating or embedding certain biases simply because they're overemphasizing certain fluency features, I think the first thing to do is to diagnose across L1 backgrounds and trying to see maybe if you're developing that system, let's say by different L1s, do you actually derive at different kinds of systems? Would different features be kept in your, if it's a feature-based automated scoring model, let's say, would the same set of features be kept, right? Do they have different kind of prominence when they're actually predicting proficiency, right? If we find there are these nuances, maybe that give us a context to dig deeper. At least it suggests there might be some differences across L1 that could be to bias.
All right, the next question. How do you see the role of speaker effect when considering fluency's role in language proficiency? People may speak more quickly when they're excited or with more disfluencies when anxious. I wonder about considering fluency as a range of possibilities, even within one speaker, rather than as a static value.
Yeah. It's a complex question, I can tell you, because this is a question that we think about a lot, and it's a question that get a lot of the time. People ask, like, what if someone just naturally have more disfluencies, right? Because it's true. We have different speaking styles. So chances are you might face with a speaker that just naturally have more hesitations. And this could play a role if let's say, your scoring mechanism just value individual features. But I think when contextualizing these disfluencies, you tend to get a nuanced understanding. And this is an assumption from my side, maybe my bias. I tend to think when you're contextualizing these disfluencies, you're less likely to make like glaring biases by just viewing a certain type of disfluency. And in addition to that, I do agree that if you look at disfluency and fluency literature, there's a great line of study that has already suggested that L1 fluency actually influences L2 fluency as well. So chances are when we're seeing disfluency in an L2, we might see a reflection of many things. It could be the speaker style, it could be just the nature of the first language, right? I think we need to take caution over that because I think there are studies that have shown that when you look across different L1s, even when you look at a strong feature like speed, you see big differences across different L1s. And if you look at, for example, Ginther et al.'s 2010 study, where you actually see the speech rate of Indian speakers actually being higher than so-called L1 speakers, right? So when that happens, that kind of defies our assumptions about what we're expecting in terms of fluency features. Then what is happening there? Why did they produce higher speed fluency? Is it because of the nature of their speaker style? Is it because of L1, or is it because of test taking strategies? It could be many things, right? But I think it's worth investigating. But sounds like I'm giving more questions than solutions. But I do think, and if someone is really interested in modeling this, when you think about speaker style, there are ways that allow you to create actually a baseline expectation about what this fluency is like, either for L1, if you have enough corpus studies that can back that up, Or if you want to model individual speaker style, I think there are ways that allows you to actually model that. I think you probably would need to do that by having maybe speech data from the same speakers on different languages and maybe across different tasks.
Thank you. Here's another one. How would you make this fluency chains more salient or useful for human speech raters?
Hmm. If, and this can be a big if you've identified disfluency chains that are quite meaningful predictors of language proficiency within your local context, what you can do is you can embed it into radar training programs. I think one thing I tend to find problematic is in a lot of speaking context, the radar training tend to be sort of a single occurrence event. We give a lot of materials to raters. We expect them to internalize what we want from the scale, but it never happened that way. I think we need ongoing training to, bring examples and expose raters to these different disfluency chains through examples, and hopefully they can be more sensitive to these chains. Because there are benefits, right? When you're actually training the raters to pay more attention to these meaningful indices, they will understand the construct that you're trying to assess better too.
Okay, next one is, it is interesting to hear about the need for a contextualized interpretation of this fluency. Could you perhaps elaborate on social cultural factors that may affect this fluency?
I have to first acknowledge I'm not an expert in pragmatics, and I'm always in awe of people who want to do that because it's actually one of the projects I really want to do. What I find interesting with the sociocultural factors, one is that there are studies that demonstrate, for example, there's a gender difference. There's also a difference in terms of affect. I think, one of the earlier questions also mentioned when you're in in different kind of mental states, maybe the disfluency will actually be more pronounced or more likely to occur. But there are also a lot of discussions about, let's say, in the world of pragmatics, let's say if you're trying to, in the context of a refusal, right? If someone asks you, can you borrow me some money? Oh, can I borrow some money from you? And then your immediate reaction, or I guess from a listener's perspective, we wouldn't expect a very fluent response from the interlocutor, right? We probably expect them to hesitate a little bit, and maybe a lot of this fluency chains might indicate their hesitation, and that might be actually a pragmatic cue to the interlocutor saying, "Well, you're not going to get it," right? I think there's studies in pragmatics that has shown that around these kinds of phenomena, we tend to see slower speed when people respond. But I think there's a lot more that you can dig in because I think conversation analysis, even though they're probably approaching fluency and disfluency in a slightly different perspective and philosophy, but if you read the findings from conversation analysis, you actually find a lot of interesting alignments in what they can show. At least what I've read, a lot of the CA-based pragmatic studies and pragmatic assessment studies are actually giving us some initial suggestions to that. I think this is many years ago. I have to apologize. I mean, there was a paper also published as well. For example, Xun Yan has published about interpragmatic fluency. I think that's a construct that she referred to. I think really look at this particular phenomena. But that's a side of this fluency that we haven't seen yet much in language assessment in general, because whether or not I think there's a lot of attempt in the last few years trying to kind of bring back pragmatics under the interactional competence. If this is feasible and practical, I think that gives more space to do this fluency analysis in relation to sociocultural factors. And I think it'll be a very fruitful line of research.
Okay, I think we have time for like one or two more questions. So here's another one. Do you know of studies of the role of timing and pause duration dynamics on modulating fluency?
Time and what? Sorry.
Pause durations,
Posture and modulating
pause duration dynamics.
pause duration dynamic. That's actually interesting. And to be honest, I haven't done that in my own research. I don't know if this is actually a satisfactory answer to your question, but what actually my student Yulin Pan has looked into disfluencies, where we're trying to see whether or not these different indices can actually predict the occurrence or the probability of a seeing an occurrence of disfluency within a particular utterance. Where, but I don't think I'm actually answering your question in that because what we're trying to predict is actually the occurrence and the duration of disfluency, not like using it as a moderator.
Okay, one last question. To what extent do you think the productivity dimension of fluency should or shouldn't be considered construct relevant?
Uh, so this is
Talk.
related to the nature of disfluency, right? Whether or not that should be part of the construct.
Mhm.
I think so. I really think so. Even though we don't have a consensus on how it should relate to proficiency, I do think it should be because, you know, even though we've in some ways achieved success in linking fluency variables or so-called macro fluency variables to proficiency scores, I think ultimately our goal as language testers is also to think about the theory, to think about the construct too, right? I think um, the macro fluency variables can be very good proxies of proficiency scores, but they really lack in terms of explaining the construct. Because if we just look at the proficiency variables based on the meta-analysis, all we can say is, well, as proficiency increases, we expect faster speech, fewer disfluencies. But that's not how we speak, right? We'd like to see more, at least hypotheses and theories about what is as proficiency develops, right, how does the nature of speech production changes and how is that reflected through disfluency and fluency, right? I think in that domain, we need more studies on disfluency. So definitely the nature of disfluency should be part of the construct that we examine.
All right. I'm sorry we aren't able to go over all the questions, but if anyone has any further questions, feel free to contact Xun directly. Um, yeah. And again, thank you all very much for attending our webinar today.